Welcome to Subject to Power. I'm Elle. In this episode, we will be talking about a subject matter that is very contested, and people have very strong feelings on all sides. Not everyone who listens will agree, and some might be offended that we're having the conversation in the first place. In fact, conversation or debate regarding this issue, that is transgenderism or gender ideology, has been effectively forbidden and shut down for many years. And people who have dared to raise concerns have been hounded and persecuted and punished in all kinds of ways. To my mind, this is why we must talk about it, why we must open up a dialogue and take a critical look at what is actually happening, but also to examine the reasons why there is such an authoritarian prohibition against any kind of dissent. Why are we not allowed to talk about it? And in this hour, I'm talking to author Lecuona, who has spent many years researching what sparked the transgender movement and how gender ideology became such a pervasive social phenomenon, and also what exactly it entails for boys and men and girls and women who become trans-identified, as well as, of course, the impact on women and women's rights. Laura wrote a book about all of what she found, and also why radical feminists in particular are sounding the alarm and mounting such an opposition to gender ideology. Her book is called Gender Identity, Lies and Dangers, and that's what we're talking about today. Thank you for coming on the show. I've interviewed people on a wide range of subjects, and I've kind of steered clear of the transgender issue because I find that it sucks up so much oxygen in the feminist space. So I've been hesitant. I've touched on it a few times with different guests, but I haven't gone deep into the subject matter. And so I really appreciate, in particular, your book, Gender Identity, Lies and Dangers, that came out last year?
I believe it was 2 years ago, maybe.
Yeah. And what I appreciate about it is that it takes such a overarching view of the phenomena of transgenderism, and that it doesn't try to simplify it. You really embrace the complexities of what has happened and how these things flow together. And I think that's what I appreciate most, because some people say, oh, it's all about the money. It's money driven. I don't think it's one thing. I think it's many things.
You're absolutely right. There are many things feeding into the transgender phenomenon. I'm glad you read it that way, because that's what I intended to do with the book. People who are not much in this discussion, they don't understand what is happening. I wanted to give those people a basis for understanding and making their own mind about it. Because, as you will know, the transgender proponents vilify anyone who dissents. And so the feminist voices are not heard, because people think, well, they say there are Nazis, they say there are very bad people, they must be.
Yeah.
I wanted to show the arguments of each of the parts and to make some history about it. This has exploded now. Well, a few years ago, in the last decade, it has exploded exponentially. But this has been going around much longer than people think. But feminist authors have seen it clearly since the 70s. I'm fully aware that there are people who consider themselves trans, but what I challenge is the very idea, of course, being born in the wrong body, being a disalignment between the sex and the gender identity, because I don't think, as many feminists don't think, there's a gender identity at all. Because positing the existence of a gender identity is to claiming that sexual stereotypes are in fact embedded in our brains. We are born with the gender identity. That is to say, we are born with the sexist stereotypes, and you cannot fight those sexual stereotypes if you truly believe we are born with them.
Yeah, so true. So I'm just curious as to how you got drawn into this issue, how you discovered this issue or became involved in it in the first place.
Since I was very young, I read about sexual stereotypes, so I was well aware of how they work. And I was aware that some people, back then they were called transsexuals. I was aware that there were people who claimed to be transsexuals, and people approached them with empathy. And of course, I approached them with empathy as well. But it was a very mysterious thing to me. How can they claim to be born in the wrong body? How can they claim to be women if they are men, if they're only pointing to sexual stereotypes? We can challenge sexual stereotypes without claiming to be the other sex. In 2017, I read an article in the New York Times about the first girl being allowed into the Boy Scouts Club
Oh, yeah.
because she was now considered transgender. So that was seen as a very progressive thing. The New York Times was applauding it because a girl was finally accepted in the Boy Scouts because she claimed she was really a boy. And of course, when I was a young girl, I was like her. I also would have wanted to belong to the Boy Scouts, as so many feminists and so many lesbians. I also preferred boys' games than playing with dolls, for example. But of course, no one told me that meant that I was, in fact, a boy. And I'm grateful for it because I am well aware that if that girl I was 50 years ago was born in 2010, for example, I would have been that little girl who claimed to be a boy and was put on the transgender path.
Yes.
And I wrote a note about it and tried to explain what was wrong with that view. And before that, I wasn't aware that there were feminists being glad about this transgendering of children, that there was a debate being had, a debate trying to be silenced. Of course, immediately after I published this article, the transgender activists, they attacked me and they started accusing me of transphobia, hate speech, and all of that. And that was sort of a surprise for me because I was very naive, of course. But I thought that the transgender movement had not landed in Mexico yet. I was very wrong about it. It was in the universities. The transgender invasion of the institutions had already been in Mexico. And also, there were self ID laws in some parts of Mexico. There was no discussion about it. Suddenly, gender identity appeared in the laws and all that comes with it.
Mm.
That's how I started being active in this discussion because, of course, these trans activists wanted to silence me, but I wasn't going to do it. On the contrary, I saw how important it was to keep having the discussion.
If somebody's trying to silence you, it's a pretty good sign that you're onto something important.
Yeah, that's right.
As feminists, you know. But so I wanted to go back a little bit. There are two kind of very important things that led the groundwork for this being able to unfold the way it has. And you name those things as, first of all, creating gender and splitting it away from sex. And then also at the same time as feminism got really lost and kind of lost its original values and goals, I think. And you talk about both of those things. Can you explain a little bit how gender came to be and also what has happened with feminism?
I don't think feminists are the guilty party. Of
Agreed.
course, many feminists have bought into it. And it's true, some women who claim to be feminists have lost feminist values. And yes, it's true that the concept of gender is fundamental in this debate. Once upon a time, there came to be feminist studies in the universities. That was a huge win for feminism, which is a solid theory, but it hadn't the respectability, so to say, that something which is taught in a university has. So feminist studies, great. But suddenly the name changed. It's changed to gender studies. And the explanation was, well, gender is more inclusive than feminism. In gender studies, we don't study only women's troubles or women's issues. We also study, well, homosexuality, queer people, men who are challenging masculinity, many things that don't have anything to do at all with the most important feminist issue of all times, which is male violence against women. Gender studies came along, and these women didn't lose their jobs. They only had to adapt to the new ideology, in fact. We used to talk about sexual stereotypes and challenge them, but let's call them now gender stereotypes. An innocent move. It seemed like only a very small change of terms, and what can go wrong?
Yeah. And maybe friendlier to men, not so alienating to men.
Yeah, that's it. Because many feminists want to be agreeable to men. That's even in feminists, that's a very powerful motivation. No, but yeah, they stopped talking about sexual stereotypes. Now they're gender stereotypes. No talk about sexual violence. Let's talk about gender-based violence. In 1995, the fourth United Nations Conference on Women was urging governments from all over the world to include a gender perspective on their policies. The women were asked to define the term. What do you mean by gender? And they said, well, we mean what everybody understands by it. You cannot do that because everyone understands those kind of terms, ambiguous terms, as everyone wants. And that's what we are seeing now, where gender really started to appear everywhere. Gender here and gender there. And gender studies had a boom. Of course, it was a smart marketing strategy.
Yeah.
Changing it from feminist studies or women's studies to gender studies, because, of course, men are more welcome in it. And women who don't want to be seen as men haters are more comfortable there. If feminists in the 70s were fighting against sexual stereotypes, suddenly calling them gender stereotypes made them more of maybe a good thing. If one can choose their gender, the gender stereotypes, as something that defines us as people, that is very important for our identity. So that's how nowadays feminists like me and like many other radical feminists who are still fighting against those stereotypes are being seen as hateful bigots because they are denying the identity of poor victims or poor men who don't want anything but to challenge gender stereotypes.
And also, of course, like what they wanted to do, I think, was to separate gender from anything biological.
Yes, that's an important point. Because when feminists, Simone de Beauvoir famously said that one is not born a woman, of course, Simone de Beauvoir wasn't saying that you can become a woman by putting on lipstick or using high heels. She was not saying that. She was explaining, if you read the whole book, you can see that she was not saying that one can become a woman just by willing it, but that society is instilling in people femininity and masculinity and making those traits opposed one from the other. And in fact, women are seen as second-class citizens, as a second sex, but not because of their biology, That's because of the social vision of women and men, the social status of women and men. And that social status, unequal social status, because of course men are dominant in the society, and that's a fact. But this didn't mean that we are not biological beings, that we are not part of nature.
Yeah.
That meant that those stereotypes were created by men, were created by a social structure. They were taught to children. Nothing about being a woman in the biological sense means being willing to be subservient to men, being willing to be beautiful
Exploited.
like
Yeah.
tall coasts. So feminists who understand clearly what sexual stereotype means should know better when confronted with the transgender phenomenon, because what these men are saying is that they can be women if only they wish it, and they can be women because look at me, how feminine am I. But no, feminists would say that doesn't make you a woman. You can all use all the makeup you want. You can use dresses, but that doesn't make you a woman. And saying this truth that everyone acknowledges if they stop to think for a minute makes us bigots and hateful people who have to be silenced. That's where we are now.
Yeah, I feel like gender was used as kind of like this magic wand that was going to disappear all sexual stereotypes. But of course, like as long as the hierarchy of men and women exists that has a biological basis, calling it gender isn't going to give us freedom from that.
Why are women considered lesser than men if not for our biological capacities? If you
Exactly.
study the origin of patriarchy as Gerda Lerner did, you will see that it is because women, they give birth to babies, they
Yeah.
give birth to
Yeah.
people. They are the ones who get pregnant, and they are the ones who have that wonderful capacity of giving birth. That's why we are considered lesser than men, because there's a patriarchal reversal. It is our biology that is a pretext to consider us lesser than men. Women are seen as lesser beings. If you don't see that, what do you think is causing this inequality? No? And also, quote unquote, challenging gender stereotypes as trans identified people do it, claiming that a woman who takes testosterone and has a beard is challenging it, or men that put on a lipstick and they say I am feminine are quote unquote challenging it. It's only empowering those stereotypes. They
Yes.
are not really challenging them, but they are
Enforcing them.
enforcing them. Yeah, that's
Yes,
it.
yes, making them stronger.
Hmm.
Absolutely. The idea that transgenderism is a rebellion against sexist stereotypes just doesn't, there's no evidence for that, I feel. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to, and I'm glad you protested a bit about this watered down feminism that we have, what I would refer to as choice feminism or liberal feminism. But I think had feminism not been at this very sort of weak stage for a lot of women, I don't know that transgenderism would have been able to slam through the way it has. But let me hear what you think about that.
By playing along with transgenderism, they are giving it validity, because feminism in the 1990s was more respected than 30 or 40 years before. And there are many more women who claim to be feminists than before. And there are women in positions of power who claim to be feminists. And yes, they have been instrumental in allowing this notion of a gender identity and into laws. Maybe they are not the main actors, but in the end, it's their feminine upbringing, so to say.
Socialization?
Yeah, yes. What is driving them to applaud these men who claim to be women? Deep inside, they also know they are males and they are pandering to them. And this is a very sad spectacle.
Yeah. If I'm hearing you right, even if we're feminists, we're still socialized women, and that women will always want to be, or we're taught to be inclusive, to welcome everyone, to not exclude anyone, to not be unkind, to have a welcoming attitude towards everyone. And the idea of excluding women, even though they're men who say they're women, is seen as mean-spirited or bad.
They say, who am I to say they are not feminists? But you only have to read the history of feminism and be clear what feminism wants to accomplish to know that women who say prostitution is a job and it is empowering, that there can be such thing as feminist pornography, that the main goal of feminism is allow males into women's spaces. They cannot be feminists. I call them also liberal feminists, but the truth is they are not feminists at all.
In reality, yeah.
Yeah, in reality.
I feel like the most basic definition of feminism ought to be, if you're a feminist, you're working towards the interests of women. And if you're not doing that, then I don't think the title fits, So, in your book, you outlined 3 theories or 3 models of transgenderism that I found super helpful in just kind of outlining how this history sort of unfolded. So, the first model is the medical sexological model, and the second is the transgenderist model, and the third is the radical feminist model. And I would love for you to just talk about each of those, what they mean, and placing them in history.
Yes, of course. So I wanted to study these 3 big approaches to the transgender phenomenon. And I have to go back in history. And in the beginning, when transsexuality started to be a thing, and there were men who claimed to be women and wanted to appear as women, to seem as women, the condition of possibility were some surgical procedures that helped those men who wanted to be seen as women appear more feminine, for example, or taking the penis away. That's a procedure some men were seeking. And there was a mutual collaboration between the medical sexological enterprises, so to say, and the people, mainly men, who called themselves transsexual because those men wanted surgical procedures and the medical sexological model was willing to do it. Typically, those men were homosexual men with an internal homophobia, if you wish, no, but not only. So they were together in this search for more surgical procedures, for more acceptance in society.
Were they considered that they were disordered then?
Yes, there had to be a diagnosis in order to make this procedure. There had to be a diagnosis. And some sexologists came up with the idea of misaligned gender identity. That's where the concept began to be used. No, what's the trouble with these men? Why will we cut their penis off if they are not ill? What's the purpose of it? Well, they have this gender misalignment and they are women on the inside, and they need to see themselves as women on the outside as well.
So, like a physical / psychological problem that needed to be solved, in other words.
A psychological problem that had a physical procedure as its solution. That's the main characterization of this medical sexological model. Then there's the transgender model, which in the beginning it was the same as the medical sexological model. In fact, transsexuals wanted these surgeries to be available to them. That was their main petition. That was what they wanted. But suddenly they said, no, no, we don't want the surgeries to be the defining aspect of a trans person. We want to be considered not only trans, but we want to be considered as someone of the opposite sex without surgery. We want to be recognized as women or as men, if it's a woman who is claiming it, only because we say so. And why only because we say so? Why because we say so? Because that doesn't exist. Of course, it's an invention, it's a theory, it's an ideology, it's that is born of the idea that one can have women's identity in a male body. That reminds us of the sexual stereotypes. What does it mean to be women on the inside? Being a woman means having a female body because that's what we are. We are material people. Even the brain is material. So the transgender model plays into this idea of having a body on the one part and a soul on the other part. No, and this soul can be feminine or masculine. And sometimes people are born with the male body, but with the female
Essence.
psyche or female psychology. That
Mm-hmm.
makes no sense. If you really understand how sexual stereotypes work, that makes no sense at all. If you study the thing, you will see that embedded in the idea of being transgender people is the idea of, that we have some kind of gendered soul.
Mm-hmm.
Feminism, on the other hand, is a materialistic theory. We don't posit the existence of gendered souls. In fact, we challenge them.
The other thing that you mentioned in the book for the transgenderist model is that they kind of got rid of the pathology.
Yes, and the transgender model nowadays is supposedly against the pathologizing of transgender people.
So it's no longer a disorder.
It is no longer a disorder, depending on what you want to attain. When they want to attain free hormones and free surgeries and their seguro médico insurance to pay for the procedures, of course it has to be a little pathological because it's a matter of life and death. They need those procedures and children need those puberty blockers, otherwise they will kill themselves. That's what they say.
Yeah.
But you cannot make them have a surgery. Now, what they want is to be considered as someone of the opposite sex with no requisite at all self ID. That is the main point in their political agenda. So, to be considered as a woman being a man, you don't need to have got your penis off. You only need to say you're a woman on the inside. And everyone must believe you because there's no possibility of lying. No, there are no lies in the transgender model. If someone says they are transgender or says they're a woman when they have a male body or says they're a man when they have a female body, we must believe them, and everything else is transphobia. You must believe them. A man cannot be a woman, not through surgery, not through hormones, and of course, not through self ID. Men can't be women. This is not a value judgment. This is the truth. They are men. That's the only thing we're saying. They are men. And we are also saying considering them women is detrimental to women's rights because women's rights were meant for women. Women's rights exist because women have special needs, because women are the subordinate class in the society and they need
Subordinate to men, I want to add.
To men, of course. Yes, yes. So they need their sex-based rights. They need their women-only spaces. They need their categories in sports because before 2010, everybody knew that males have a physical advantage in sports. No, males are bigger, males are stronger. Suddenly we have to prove that males have physical advantages in sports, and we are the ones who have to prove it. Everybody knew it 10 years ago. Suddenly that everyone forgot that.
And so the third model I found the most interesting because you're presenting our side, and you start off that chapter saying radical feminists are the original gender nonconforming people. Feminists came up with gender nonconforming.
Yeah, of course. If these people who claim to be challenging the gendered norms were really doing it, we would be the best of friends.
So true.
But they're not doing it.
Yeah.
That's what I want to prove in the book. What you said, they're only reinforcing the gender mandates. They're claiming this very absurd idea that we thought we have overcome, that being a woman is being a bunch of stereotypes. Feminists, as I said before, have fought against gender stereotypes. They have always done it, and they still are. And of course, if we fight gender stereotypes, we have to fight the idea that we are made of stereotypes.
Yes.
No? That's the idea that transgenderism is enforcing. And in this section, the radical feminist model, I do justice to all those feminists who saw it coming, as I say, especially Janice Raymond and Sheila Jeffries. And I think credit is due to these women who saw it, since Janice Raymond wrote her book, The Transsexual Empire, in 1979.
Yeah.
One of the most important books written about the subject. Even when it was written in 1979, it explains a lot of what we are seeing now. And also, I have to point out, the transsexual empire, this concept Janice Raymond is referring to, is to the medical sexological model. She was seeing, and she was very worried, that some men who weren't comfortable role playing sexual stereotypes of what being a man means, she was very worried of seeing how these men were told, if you are feminine enough, if you walk this way and you use makeup this way and you dress up this way, you might pass as a woman. And if you pass as a woman, you may be eligible to a surgical procedure that will make you more like a woman. And she said they are damaging the bodies of these poor men who cannot cope with the idea of being non masculine men, and they have to believe themselves to be women. But society must accept them as feminine men, not as women, of course, but they shouldn't have to be pushed towards a surgical procedure.
No, and the feminists said that from the beginning, or those feminists that Sheila Jeffries and Janice Raymond and others, really rang the alarm and said, this is not a good development. Like, we need to fight for freedom of expression, freedom of thought and belief that's broad and wide, and anyone can be anywhere on the spectrum of, of masculine and feminine without surgery and medication.
Yes. Janice Raymond said these physicians and doctors and sexologists are pushing these men to surgeries because they don't accept them, or these men themselves don't accept themselves as feminine men. But suddenly, the transgender model in a second phase was, as you pointed out, was against pathologization. That's what Janice Raymond said in 1979. But if you mention her name to these people, they will vilify her more than anyone. They don't want people to read the feminists because that would be very clarifying for everybody. The feminist discourse is very effective against these damaging ideas of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. But of course, we are more worried about the young women who are being pushed to make double mastectomies, to take the uterus away, to make phalloplasties and damage their bodies in an irreversible way because they believe that doing this to their bodies will convert them into men. No, we are very worried about these young women.
That's the most upsetting part of all of this, I think, for older radical feminists like us, especially, to see this like young generation go through these horrific body mutilations, which makes them sterile and deforms them and makes them medical patients for life. Very, very upsetting stuff, which brings us to, you have a whole chapter about creating the transgender child. And I don't know if people really make the connection between the adult transgender movement and then there's the trans kids and protect trans kids and all of this language and the movement that's around trans children. And it's hard to connect that with the adult population. If you can talk a little bit about why the transgender child, what is happening?
Following on these three models of transgenderism, the transsexual model didn't have a transsexual child in it until very recently. Because if the main point of your political agenda is to push self ID into the legislations, you need to prove that transgenderism, as they call it, that having a gender identity misaligned with your body is something people are born with. And what better proof of this idea can there be than the transgender child? The transgender child is living proof that you are born transgender. No? That is not something acquired through ideas that you've heard or read, through porn consumption. We have to believe that there are some people who are born in the wrong body. The invention of the transgender child is a political maneuver to prove this. No? When you realize this, it's very enraging because they are sacrificing young girls and young boys in order for some men, for some adult men, maybe fetishistic men, to be considered women. They are being operated upon. They are going through surgeries. They are having their puberty blocked. They are having irreversible damage done to their bodies because some males, some adult males, want to be seen as women no matter what.
Yeah.
And no children claimed to be transgender until very recently. The numbers demonstrate that something is happening. If 20 years ago, maybe 20 or 30 or 100 children went to the Tavistock Gender Clinic to
In the
be
UK. Yeah.
in the UK to seeking for help with their gender dysphoria, as they call it. Now it's thousands and thousands. What happened in between? The transgender discourse went mainstream, and we have propaganda everywhere in movies, TV shows, in the universities, in books for children.
It is extraordinary when you start contemplating how captured institutions of all kinds are across the board, like you said, education from K to 12, universities, law, medicine, sports. It is truly extraordinary. You talk about the role of schools in constructing the transgender child and how, schools have adopted wholesale the inclusivity philosophy and how they are essentially shutting down debate or dissent on this issue and making children conform or else.
Yes, they are not teaching children to accept themselves and the others if they are not stereotypically feminine or stereotypically masculine. They don't invite them to accept themselves just as they are. In fact, they are teaching them that if they don't conform to the sexist stereotypes, that means maybe they aren't really girls or really boys. Maybe a girl who doesn't like to play with dolls isn't feminine enough. Maybe they are boys. And if boys are not masculine enough, maybe they are girls. Why doesn't everybody see what this entails?
How regressive it is.
Aha, yeah. It's like saying if you are a woman, you have to be feminine. Being feminine is what being a woman means, and being masculine is what being a boy means or a man.
And unless you fit in that narrow stereotype, off to the gender clinic you go
Ah,
and get
yes,
put on puberty blockers and the
yes.
rest.
And this is seen as a good solution, as the empathetic one. These kids don't need hormones, they don't need puberty blockers, they don't need surgeries. They only need to be accepted as they are and need to accept themselves as they are. Why don't these kids accept themselves? Why do these kids believe they were maybe born in the wrong body? Because society is telling them so. I'm sure there are people who are doing this and are playing along with all this out of naivete. They mean well, but they should know better.
Truly. Now, another big factor, I think, which you talk about also, is online social contagion. The idea of social contagion, especially in girl groups, because that is something that's well known for teenage girls, is that they're very susceptible to social contagion. It's been documented in all kinds of ways in the past. And the fact that television shows like Jazz Jennings, these hugely influential media and social media that normalizes all of this.
Yes, it was the American researcher Lisa Littman who first observed that the gender clinics were having much more patients than before. Then the numbers were escalating and were exploding. And she said, there has to be an explanation. This doesn't happen without a cause. There must be a cause to this sudden explosion of transgender kids coming to the clinics. She tried to find the explanation, and what she found was what you said: social media influence, social contagion. As decades before, the anorexia was also contagion, and this is well established. And Lisa Littman said maybe there's something similar happening with the transgender phenomenon. Before there were anorexic girls or girls who taught themselves.
Right, that was another
Now
one.
it's girls who believe they are men. And she made a study speaking with parents of girls who were claiming to be men, and they found, yes, suddenly there's one girl in a group of friends, and in a few weeks or months all of them are identifying as trans. It's moda is a word in Spanish.
What's the word in Spanish?
Moda.
Moda?
Sí, moda.
Fashion. It's a fad.
It's a fad. Yes, it's a fad. That's why we're seeing so many young girls claiming to be men. Of course, the conditions are a society which sees women as inferior. What we are seeing now is the objectification of women, the commodification of women, the sexualization of women is worse than ever. The pornography industry is one of these conditions that are making so many girls want to identify as boys. I'm sure many of them don't want to be seen as sex objects. That's why they suddenly find this supposed solution to their problems identifying as men. And this means destroying their bodies eventually. No?
They're trying to escape their fate as women.
Yes. Without social media, the fad wouldn't be as big as it is. Social media, pornification of the culture, those are some of the conditions in which this transgender fad is fostering. What these girls need is not a surgery or puberty blockers. What these girls need is feminism. What these girls need
Yes.
is a society which doesn't see them as inferior. Violence against women today is so much worse than when Andrea Dworkin wrote about violence against women and pornography 30 years ago. If Andrea Dworkin was living now and saw what pornography has become, that would be mind blowing for even for her. Saw what she saw.
Her absolute nightmare. Yeah.
I'm glad that I didn't come of age in this day and age, but I'm worried about my nieces who are. It's terrible. It's terrible. We don't want girls to grow up in a world that accepts male violence against women as if it was something normal, that accepts the escalation of male violence against women, that takes all their sex based rights won by feminists before them. They say, what do you care? There are more important feminist struggles. I don't think so, because the main feminist struggle, being male violence against women, is embedded in transgenderism.
I do want to get into the sort of nitty-gritty medical stuff about puberty blockers, and just to get a sense of the scope of the medical scandal that will be unfolding going forward. And it is unlike anything we've ever seen, I think. But I did want to say there's another kind of pressure on parents, and that's the suicide myth, that a lot of parents have jumped on board with their kids transing, so to speak, under the threat that, it's better to have an alive trans child than a dead girl or boy or whoever they were originally. I think that is being disproven scientifically, that in fact transing increases the risk of suicide, which you write about. But aside from that, it's just so pernicious. It's just such a bad threat that they level against parents. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that is true. The transgender movement is based on lies. They wouldn't have been able to accomplish what they have without so many lies. Important lies as are those that you have pointed out. How can you convince a mother to allow their daughter or their son to be deprived of a healthy development, if not by scaring them? They have to scare them. And they are saying, yes, they will commit suicide if you don't go along with them, if you don't give them what they want, if you don't allow them to take puberty blockers, if you don't support them in their wanting to transition, quote unquote. And then they do. They are very scared. So these poor parents, that's what they hear, that's what they find out, or that's what they come to believe. They love their children, and then they do what they believe is best for them.
Mm-hmm.
There are also parents who know deep inside that there's something wrong with this narrative. They can't believe their kid has to transition in order for him or her to be a happy human being. And they resist the transgendering of their children. You don't have to be a feminist, you don't have to be a radical feminist to know that there's something,
To be skeptical.
to be skeptical and to see that there's something very shady going on.
And parents, of course, can just feel like, here's my perfect child who's going to go and get her 13, 14-year-old breasts cut off. There are parents who will just react with care and who will try to refuse that to happen just because they feel on some biological level that it's just wrong.
Yes. But of course, there are also parents who really don't like their boy being feminine and who really don't like their girl not being feminine enough.
Sure.
And when someone tells them, oh, there's a remedy for this, they seek it. They say, oh, yes, please. take them to the transgender camp and show this boy how to be a girly girl. Because this idea of the gendered souls is more acceptable to a genuinely retrograde mentality than to a feminist one.
Yeah, sure.
Conservatives are more prone to believing that a girl has to be feminine and a boy has to be masculine than a feminist might. Tavistock Clinic was fundamental for the transgendering of children in the UK.
Now closed.
It is now closed, but it is closed thanks to some whistleblowers, but several of them pointed out that parents brought their children to the clinic because they didn't want them to be homosexual or lesbian in the future. They saw signs of gender nonconformity. And there's another truth here. Gender nonconformity in children might be indicative of homosexuality and lesbianism in the future. That might be true, but for many people, it is a problem. They do prefer a mutilated girl who can pass as a boy than a lesbian daughter. They do prefer that, and their actions prove it. Of course, mutilate is another one of those words that are termed transphobic. It is a descriptive word that describes what they are doing to boys who have their penis cut off and of girls who have double mastectomies. Mutilation is a word that describes this. But the truth is so hard to bear for people. Transgender activists know that. So let's not use these words that describe what is happening. Let's use euphemisms that disguise what is really happening.
Gender affirming care.
Gender affirming care, for example. Yes, that's not gender affirming care. That's mutilation. That is stopping the development of your child, because blocking puberty, it's a very serious intervention. The brain is not fully developed at puberty. Of course, the hormones work in the development of the brain and the body, and they are stopping it. There are no studies that show that this is safe, and there are no studies that prove that this serves any other purpose. The only purpose blocking puberty serves is boys who can pass better as women and girls who pass better as males. That's what the adult transgender males saw. They're not happy with their lack of passing. Passing is the word they themselves used to refer to, is my disguise
good enough to pass as the actual sex that you're trying to simulate?
Can I convince other people that I'm a woman while being a man? That is passing. Almost no man has sufficient passing.
Yeah.
Because, of course, they are taller, they are bigger, they have bigger hands, their voice doesn't change even though they take feminine hormones, and they're not happy with their insufficient passing. So they say, I wish I could have puberty blockers when I was 12 years, because now I would pass better as a woman. They're punishing children now because they are not passing enough as they wish.
Sure.
That's another of the scandalous things about it.
I don't think we talk enough about, and I don't think there's enough public dialogue about exactly what is being done. When you take puberty blockers before you hit puberty as a boy, your penis won't develop, your balls won't drop. As everyone around you continue to mature, you won't mature, and that you can't just undo that. It is a permanent change. Cognitive damage to the brain, like you were referring to earlier, bone growth damage. It's being reported now that women, young girls are walking around with crutches because their bones are so brittle, because the puberty hormones that should have made your bones into adult strength bones are not, and they're misaligned. And there's so many reports, not to mention sterility and not being able to have a child.
Yeah, but once again, this is not being talked about enough because we are deemed transphobe the minute we say, wait a minute, there can be damages to it. No, 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 that's transphobia because we have to go along with every child who says, I want to be someone of the other sex. And even psychologists who search for another way of alleviating this, what they call gender dysphoria, I don't use that term, who don't ascribe to the gender affirming care model but want to listen to children and try a different approach and use talk therapy to help them overcome this discomfort, they are accused of practicing, how do they call it? Corrective therapy.
Oh, yeah.
No? 30
Conversion
years
therapy.
ago, lesbians were treated with conversion therapy to be made into heterosexual women. This was a thing. There was violence exerted against lesbians because they didn't want to marry a man. So corrective rape was employed. This is horrendous. And now trans activists are claiming that a psychologist who wants to listen to a child who calls themselves transgender is akin to conversion therapy because by helping them to accept themselves as the boys they are or the girls they are and end their discomfort, they claim they are converting them into cis people. And so they call it conversion therapy to not allow a boy to cut his penis off or not to allow a girl to go through a double mastectomy. It's transphobic not to do that in the eyes of the transgender movement. And that's one of the things they are scaring parents with. You have to let them. Once again, it's a language reversal. Language plays a huge role in all this mess.
Yes, yes. Meanwhile, we'll now have like a whole generation, if not more, of women with their arm skin taken off and made into a skin roll penis that's sewn onto their vagina with some kind of channel for the urination. Their genitals are completely ruined. And the same with boys that will grow up without a penis or a penis that's inverted into a so-called vagina. None of these genitals actually work. A woman who has a skin roll penis isn't going to be able to have erection or sexual pleasure. A man who has an inverted penis isn't going to experience a vaginal orgasm or have the glands in there that makes it a pleasurable experience. They are ruined sexually.
Yes, this is another thing you can't talk about because they are not being informed about what can happen if they go along with these surgeries. There are also detransitioners,
Yes.
young people who bought into this ideology and who went surgical interventions or puberty blockers, etc. And now they have come to understand that wasn't what they needed.
Yeah.
But of course, they are as vilified as feminists, if not more, because they are the living contradiction. They prove trans ideology wrong. They prove all of these ideas wrong.
They are the evidence.
The walking evidence that this is nonsense.
Yeah. And that they were damaged so badly in the process and now are trying to live out their lives in bodies that are so damaged. Yeah.
But because if children who are suffering from their gender nonconformity, so to say, right now, it will be good for them to listen to other children who have lived it and are regretting doing the interventions and regret having identified as trans and everything that came with it. This goes against the propaganda machinery and they have to silence them.
You brought up obviously the part that you and I might care about more than anything else is the invasion of women's spaces and the kind of full frontal attack on feminism. That's kind of the hardest part for me. If you really just wanted the right to exist and be left in peace and have your rights as all other human beings, I think the thing to do would have been to create a third space and to create more tolerance and to make sure that everyone's rights are respected in the process. But that is not what has happened at all.
This is an invasive movement, and of course they don't want to have a peaceful life and be left alone and not be discriminated against. That's not what they want. They want to be the center of every women's spaces there are. They want to be the center of feminism. They want to be able to go into every women's space, be it sports, be it jails, prisons, be it lesbian spaces.
Breastfeeding groups, birthing support, anything female.
This is a males' rights movement por antonomasia, I would say in Spanish, the ultimate males' rights movement. Because
Yeah.
they have succeeded in having males enter every formerly male-free space there was.
Yeah.
There was.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
Feminism, for example. And feminism is a movement by women for women. Well, not anymore, or not if we let them have what they want. Because that's what we are seeing. When we are losing possible feminists to this ideology, because a young woman in her 20s wants to be a feminist, what does she find in way of a feminist group? A queer group, a transgender centered group. No, the idea that these men are also women, they are the best women, and so you have to pander to them. That is what they are finding out. Because beware of those bad feminists that are the radical feminists, and don't allow these men into the spaces. And they are, of course, trans exclusionary radical feminists, TERF, as they call us.
Right, but also a number of organizations that are formally helpful to women, like Planned Parenthood or Pregnancy Justice, or other NGOs like Human Rights Watch even, or Amnesty International. The entire NGO space is now captured.
Yeah,
and
UN Women.
UN Women, same thing. So it's not just like marginal feminist organizations. It's really the entire world of women's rights that are now in the gender ideology business.
It's a huge, huge invasion. And there are many spaces, you have mentioned several of them, but lesbianism is another one. It was the ultimate male free space. But now, of course, there are males who claim to be women, but they are in fact heterosexual males. But if they claim to be women and they are attracted towards women, oh, then they are lesbians. And they want their place in a lesbian association. They want their place in a lesbian group, in a lesbian reading group, in a lesbian bar. And that is destroying, if not has already destroyed a good part of it, lesbian culture. Having males convince lesbians that they should like their female dick, as they call it, it's outrageous. It's outrageous. No, of course it's funny because it's absolutely absurd, but this is happening.
Yeah, it's kind of, the ultimate rape culture, really.
Absolutely. This is rape culture at its most. Yes, the vitriol towards J.K. Rowling, rape threats. It has been very vicious, very aggressive, very violent. I think it's transparent that they hate women. If you look at the insults they use,
Yes.
they hate women. And of course, there are many males amongst those who are throwing rape threats. Women don't do that.
Yeah.
They're males.
Yeah.
These males that are outraged at the very notion of a woman saying, no,
Yeah.
you cannot enter this space. They don't want this to happen. And it's very convenient for them to pass as feminists while threatening women. to pass as feminists while denying women their sex-based rights. For example, their free speech, their right to a safe space, their right to a rape shelter free of males. These men deny that, but we have to believe there are feminists and they're interested in women.
And pro-woman.
For women.
And this was particularly evident, I think, now in the UK with the Supreme Court decision that declared that the Equality Act is based on biological sex and women enjoy protection based on their biological sex. And now there's been demonstrations, violent, riotous demonstration with, just hateful messaging, violently misogynistic messaging by trans-identifying men in the streets of the UK.
But not only trans-identified males.
Right.
Even those who they would call cis men are enraged at women for defending their rights.
What does that tell you about the movement as a whole? I think it's a misogynistic movement, and we don't talk about that. They also, of course, want to position themselves, and you write about this as well, that they very much want to position themselves as a civil rights movement of a highly marginalized people, a victimized group of people. Can you talk about why that might not be the case?
It should be clear by now that what they want, that it's not rights for themselves. What they want is to end women's rights. That's what they are doing.
Yeah.
As you said, if they really wanted to be left alone, they would fight for third spaces, but that's not the case. That's not what they want. In the example of the toilets, they want to be able to pee in the women's toilets. They just want to pee. Of course, there's evidence to the contrary. Internet is full of videos of these men masturbating in women's toilets because that's what they want. They don't want to pee. They want to invade. And what better way to show who's in charge? And what better way? It's masturbating in a women's toilet is like putting the flag in the moon.
Yeah, staking your claim.
We are here. Let's masturbate and film ourselves masturbating and post it in social media.
Right. And what's funny is that is the most male thing ever. You couldn't display male behavior any more obvious than that.
Yeah, that's right. But what happens if you say to them, well, we won't allow males into this women's restroom, but there's a genderless toilet here for you. No, I don't want that. I want to be able to go into the women's room. Of course, that's not a civil rights movement. They don't defend women's rights. They only defend their male rights at the expense of women's sex-based rights and our right to freedom of assembly, our right to have a movement of our own as feminism, the right to have a female category in sports, etc., is based on our sex. The minute you allow males into them, there cease to be women's rights.
That's right.
And the presence of males in the female category in sports, the presence of males in a women's shelter goes against those very rights that the Rape Crisis Center or the category of women in sports were meant to defend. Women don't have the right to a category, to their own category in sports anymore.
That's right. It's mixed sex.
Yes,
it's males and then it's mixed sex.
Yes, they aren't a civil rights movement. But it is true that people who aren't aware of what is happening, who go along with the narrative, who just listen to the shouts of the transgender movement, won't see this. They are indeed seen as the civil rights of our time. So that's why so many people go along with it and get on board with transgenderism.
And so someone pays for that propaganda. That's another aspect to it, too. I don't think your general Joe and Jane knows how well-funded this project is or where that money comes from.
No, they don't know. The person who has studied this more deeply is Jennifer Billig. The money is everywhere, and it's very clear. You don't have to believe her. You can Google yourself. No, who is funding this organization, and there it is.
Very big money in this movement. And, she really points to the kind of greater transhumanism movement too, which is very connected to this. But suffice it to say that there's a lot of money being spent on this.
Huge amounts.
Yeah. The saddest part for me is the fact that they've been successful in turning feminist women against each other. There are many people I can't have conversation with because I know this issue is between us, and that they just will turn on you if you speak too explicitly about this. As feminists, we have so many important projects that we need to tend to. We have so many big problems that we still need to address. And I feel like this is a gigantic distraction that's been taking up all of our time for the last decade.
Yeah, it's very sad. And of course, it's a distraction. There are many feminist issues that have to be dealt with, but it stands in the way. This is another proof that transgenderism is a destructive movement. It wants to destroy feminism, which gives us an idea, we can have an idea of how important feminism really is. They want to end it. We are a great force standing between them and their intention of ending with our rights.
Such a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for taking me through. It's simple, but it's complicated. I know how I feel, but I also know how confused many are about this, and they don't know what side to land on. I hope this can be clarifying for a lot of people.
I hope so, yes.
Yeah.
And thank you, Elle. I'm very grateful to you for having me here in your podcast.
Thank you for listening to Subject to Power. You can find the show online at subjecttopower.com or subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts. I'd love to know your thoughts on these conversations, so please drop a note on the website or find us on social media. The best way to support the show is to rate and review Subject to Power on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other listeners find us. Subject to Power is written, hosted, and produced by me, Elle Kamihira. Audio engineering is done by Jason Sheasley at Abridged Audio. Cover art by B. Johnson, and music by Beware of Darkness.